I want to start today by inviting folks to introduce themselves so we know who's participating. And I'll start with who's in the room with me, who you can't see. So to my left is Jessie. Here she is, Jessie Everts, who's our VP of Clinical Services here at Wayside. My name is Rebecca Buller, and I'm the Education and Prevention Specialist here. And to my right is our guest speaker, Nikki Engel. And I'm going to let her introduce herself more in her presentation. Let's go to Ellie. Ellie, let's start with you. If you would unmute yourself.
Hi, folks. I'm Ellie Garrett, and I'm from the Department of Human Services. I'm one of the, program officers, grant managers, whatever you call it, in this project. And I'm dialing in today just because the presentation sounded interesting, and it's been a while since I've listened on the fabulous work that is happening with the Wayside Recovery Center Hub. So just wanted to be a little part of the party at the beginning of the year. I'm probably going to mute my picture because I'm eating lunch too, and that's a little rude to do.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Lucia.
Don't unmute yourself.
Oh, never mind. Don't unmute myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucia Diaz-French. I'm the Education and Prevention Coordinator at Wayside Recovery Center.
Can we go to DJ Morris? I can't see your face, but please let us know who you are. Okay, if you don't have audio, that's okay too. Welcome. Let's go to Kelly Harding. Kelly, can you introduce yourself? We're going to unmute you. Okay. Let's go to Kaya Foster. We're going to unmute you too.
Foster.
Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Whoop.
Can you guys hear me at all?
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Hi, this is Kaya Foster. I'm a postdoctoral resident at Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, and I actually used to work at Wayside for several years.
Wonderful. Well, I'm glad you joined us. Let's see. It looked like we got some kind of a chat message from Kelly.
If you can't unmute yourself, maybe you can type in the chat box who you are and what agency you're from. That would be helpful.
And then we've got someone at the 612. Yeah, who's on the, maybe someone's on the phone with us and we can't see who you are. Do you want to try to tell us who you are?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Well, this is Deb Morrison. I'm with HSI Victim Specialist, and I enjoy the ECHO presentations so that I can get to know what's going on in the community.
Wonderful. Welcome. Thank you so much. Now, have I hit everyone? I think so. Kenzia, at the top, I see, at the top of my screen. I don't know if it is for everybody. Kenzia, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. This is Amy Kenzie.
Hi, Amy.
Oh, hi there. Hi, Nikki, too.
Hi, Amy.
I'm with the Department of Health, Sexual Violence Prevention Program Director. I'm telecommuting today, and I'm in my jammies, so I have my picture taped up. Maybe that's too much information.
All right. Well, welcome.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So what I want to do now is turn things over to Nikki, and she will have some PowerPoints. We'll send out the presentation along with the evaluation form when we finish. And I think because there's so much to cover, really good information, we'd like to hold our questions till the end. So please jot them down because we definitely want to address them, and we'll go from there. Nikki, it's all yours.
Great.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for having me, and thanks for being here on the line. We're just pulling up my PowerPoint. So my name's Nikki Engel. I work in the anti-violence program at OutFront, Minnesota. Thank you. OutFront Minnesota is the state's oldest and largest LGBTQ equity organization. So we were founded in 1987. So we are now, this is 32nd year now since the year change. We do lots of different kinds of work. Most people are familiar with our work on policy and legislation. So the marriage equality campaign of a few years ago, Safer Schools, Anti-Bullying Act. But people tend to be less familiar with the kind of work that I do in the anti-violence program. But we are actually the oldest piece of the work being done at OutFront. OutFront started with a crisis line with the director at the time taking calls from LGBTQ Minnesotans who were experiencing violence, harassment, or discrimination across the state. So in the work that I do, we work with LGBTQ identified victims of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or hate and bias violence. So it's that last piece, that hate and bias violence, that is what makes us unique from exclusively DV work and exclusively SB work, right? That's why we call ourselves an anti-violence program, and most LGBTQ programs like ours across the country call ourselves anti-violence programs because of that third piece. So we're a broad-based effort to end violence and harassment, both against and within LGBTQ identified communities in Minnesota. We believe that everyone has the right to be safe from harm, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity and expression. Just some of the things we do. We have a 24/7 crisis line. We do peer counseling. We are a small staff. We're a very small staff, a very small program. There are 3 of us. And so we have a lawyer on staff who does legal work focused around violence. So orders for protection, harassment restraining orders, kind of family law, things like that. We have 1 licensed social worker, and then we have me who works with clients and does training and education like this, community education and prevention work as well. So we have a 24/7 crisis line, peer counseling. We do all different kinds of systems advocacy, so medical systems advocacy, court systems advocacy. We provide legal assistance, pro bono legal assistance through our lawyer. We try to run a support group or 2 a year for queer identified survivors. We have some small emergency financial assistance for people who are attempting to flee. Many members of our community don't have access to things like domestic violence shelters, right? So if someone is a male identified survivor, they typically can't access domestic violence shelters in the state of Minnesota. So those are the kinds of things we use our emergency financial assistance for, to kind of help move people, to get them to a place where they can be safe, put them up in hotels if that's all we can do in a short-term kind of situation. We do community education and outreach, and we do statewide trainings like this. Our service area is the entire state of Minnesota, so we are available to work with victims across the state. We're happy to do co-advocacy. So if you are in rural Minnesota and have an LGBTQ victim of violence and want to do some co-advocacy, please give us a call, and we're here to assist you as best we can. Who do we serve? We do serve everybody. So we specialize in working with LGBTQ survivors, but we do work with all people who are survivors of violence. We don't turn folks away. We periodically, we work with, for example, heterosexual identified men, because they often either don't believe they can receive services from traditional domestic violence agencies or have had maybe not great experiences in that arena. So yeah, so we're here to kind of work with anyone who needs our help. The only thing, we are not equipped to work with people who are doing harm, around issues of harm doing. So for example, we don't have any kind of batterers intervention program or something like that for LGBTQ folks. I'm going to start us off today by going over some LGBTQ language and terminology. In the work that I do, I find that it's really important to actually identify who is in our community, right? To folks who might be working with someone who identifies as a member of our community. So LGBTQ is the acronym that we at OutFront use. You might have seen many other letters before. You might see LGBTQI, LGBTQIA, 2S. So certainly we're not, OutFront Minnesota, we're not trying to say that this is the acronym to use, but it's the one that we feel comfortable So LGBTQ, the L is for lesbian, the G is for gay, the B is for bisexual, the T is for transgender, and the Q is for queer. I'll just make a little note about queer. I have that little asterisk next to it because it's what I call an insider word or an in-group word. So if you're a member of the community, that's your word to use. You use it as you see fit or not as you see fit. If you're not a member of the community, it's just a word you want to use with caution. For a long time, it was a derogatory slur, and there's many folks in our community who to this day don't identify with that word or feel comfortable with that word. So if someone were to identify themselves to you as a queer person, oh, I'm Nikki, I'm a queer woman, then that's the word you want to use with them because that's their identity. But if someone didn't use that word to identify themselves with you, it's a word you would just want to probably avoid, right? But sometimes you might hear the LGBTQ community, sometimes you might hear us called the queer community. So I really like that little graphic on this slide. Queer is can serve as an umbrella term, right? That we kind of all fall under. In its most basic meaning, queer just means not straight, right? It kind of isn't more specific than that, and that's why we feel it kind of covers all of us under that umbrella. I'll point out that those of us in the community, we all have very different experiences. We're not all sharing the same experience. So some of us are in this community because of our sexuality or our sexual orientation. Others of us fall into this community because of our gender identity or our gender expression or our sex assigned at birth, what I'm going to talk about in a second. So just to be aware that we don't all share the same experience. So I'm going to talk about kind of the main or major identities, most common identities that fall under the umbrella. It's not to say that there are not more, but all of us within the community tend to challenge sex and gender norms in some way. Okay, so I would say in the US currently, our sex and gender, what we can see as the norm for sex and gender, our sex and gender system tells us that there are two sexes, male or female, and that people who have a sex of male grow up to be men and are attracted to women. And people who are assigned female, that's their sex assigned at birth, grow up to be women and are attracted to men. And so we're told that is the normal way these things are supposed to work. That's the default way to be a human being in the way that we're taught about that in our culture. And so those of us within the community challenge that in some way, right? We point out, our existence shows that it's much more complicated than that story we've been given. So for example, the first kind of piece of that, so sex assigned at birth is how we talk about it in our work. And so there are folks who are assigned male at birth, folks who are assigned female, but there are also intersex folks. And this is a term for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with an anatomy that doesn't seem to align with what we think of as typical male or female anatomy. Moving on from sex assigned at birth to gender. Gender, as I'm sure you all are familiar with, has many different components. We're going to talk specifically about gender identity and gender expression because these are the ways that folks show up in our community. So gender identity then is a person's internal sense of themselves as a man, a woman, both, or neither. Okay, so if sex assigned at birth is about your physiology, your biology, your gender identity is this internal sense of yourself. So transgender then is a term for people whose gender identity or their internal sense of themselves differs from the sex they were assigned at birth. And cisgender, which is typically when I'm going out and doing these trainings, most everyone that I work with or that I've talked to has some understanding of transgender at this point, but cisgender is a word that most people have not heard. And so this is a term for people whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth. So when I was born, the doctor said, it's a girl, and I grew up to identify as a girl and then a woman. So I'm a cisgender woman or cisgender. And the reason trans folks have coined the term cisgender and advocate for us to use it is that it kind of levels the playing field, right? It tells us that these are just two different ways of having your internal sense of who you are align or not align with that sex you were assigned at birth. So being transgender or cisgender is just two different ways of having that relationship. They're both valid, they're both real, they're both authentic ways of being in the world. So specific, we'll go into a couple more specific transgender identities. So transgender man then is someone who was assigned female at birth, who identifies as male, and is transitioning or has transitioned to live as a man. So he might identify as a transgender man, a trans man, or as a man, right? Transgender woman then, a person assigned male at birth who identifies as a woman and is transitioning or has transitioned to live as a woman. Again, she might identify as a transgender woman, a trans woman, or as a woman. Some other important terms to use or to know, be familiar with: non-binary, gender fluid, genderqueer. These are terms used by some people who experience their gender identity or expression as falling and outside those categories of man or woman. So this might be people who experience in the slide before, right, as both or neither, right? And so this is just a piece the cover of the Advocate from a few months ago, beginning of October. The state of Minnesota now changed the driver's license. On a driver's license in the state of Minnesota, you can now choose M for male, F for female, or X for non-binary, gender fluid, or something else. The other really exciting for our community piece of this move on the driver's licenses is that prior to this shift, in order to get we call it a gender marker, in order to get your gender marker changed on your driver's license from M to F or F to M, it was a really complicated process. You had to prove that you were working with a psychologist or a psychiatrist, that you were living as this gender that you identify as, and it was just incredibly complicated. It was a lot of gatekeeping that was really challenging for folks in our community. And now your gender marker on your IDs in the state of Minnesota is something that you self-select. It's in the same category as eye color, hair color, weight, and gender marker. You just check what you want. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. So that's a real boon to our community. In 2016, those of you, well, we're all in Minnesota on this webinar, but you might be familiar with the fact that we do something in our state called the Minnesota State Student Survey. And so this is a survey that goes out to youth in public schools at 4 different points in their educational career. It's like 5th grade, 7th grade, 9th, and 11th grades. Most of the students in public school in the state of Minnesota take this survey. 2013 was the first year the survey asked sexual orientation. So 2013 is the first year that we have data on how LGB students are doing in Minnesota in public education. And 2016 was the first year we asked gender identity. So this is the first year we have data from how many youth in public school in Minnesota are identifying as transgender and how they're doing. So it gave us kind of 2 pieces of information. So the survey went out, was taken by 81,000 Minnesota teens in 9th and 11th grades. 2,200 of those teens, or about 3%, identified as transgender, as either transgender men, transgender women, or non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid. And so the other piece, as well as kind of giving us some numbers, we found out that those teens are also experiencing worse mental and physical health experiences, right? So they're going to school less because of harassment and bullying that they're experiencing in school. They're turning to alcohol, right, higher rates of alcohol use and things like that because, again, of the experiences they're having in school or at home as a result of their LGBTQ identity, things like that. So just to continue a little bit about gender identity, transgender people sometimes change their names, their pronouns, take hormones, or surgically alter their bodies. But it's important as service providers to remember that none of those are required to be transgender. So there's lots of reasons why someone might do 1 or 2 or 3 of those things, or all of them or none of them, right? So economics is a big reason why people cannot do some of the things on the list, but also spiritual beliefs, career of choice, mental or medical health issues. These are all reasons that someone might not do all of these things. And as service providers, it's important that we remember that that doesn't make them any less transgender. Okay, we believe people when they tell us who they are. So that's gender identity, it's internal sense of ourself. The other piece of gender I want to talk about is gender expression. And this refers to the way in which we communicate that internal sense of who we are to the outside world. And we do this in lots of ways, many of which are unconscious, right? I'm not thinking about how I'm sitting or standing or walking. That's not part of my conscious thoughts as I'm going about the day, but the ways I am sitting and standing and walking and talking are all gendered, right? They're ways that I've been socialized to express my gender in a particular way. So we talk about gender expression because we also talk about, in our community, we have folks who are what we call gender nonconforming. And so this is someone whose gender expression is different from what we expect it to be based on their gender identity, right? So this is someone who identifies as a woman, but is perhaps more masculine in their presentation, like Abby Womack there at the top, the soccer player. Or someone who identifies as a man, but is more feminine in their gender expression. And so these folks may or may not identify as transgender. Many don't, but some do. But these folks are often the folks who are experiencing, I would say, most of the daily lived harassment, experiences of violence, et cetera, on the street, right? Because of their very, the visible way in which they're kind of pushing against gender norms in our culture. Okay, lastly, sexual orientation. I don't spend a lot of time talking about sexual orientation at this point because I feel like most people have a good handle on sexual orientation and what that means in 2018. So just know that this is our sexual and romantic or emotional attraction. For many folks, those things line up. That is something I will point out, that we're sexually attracted to the same people we're romantically attracted to. But in our community, we also acknowledge that that does not always line up, right? So culturally, we're told that those things should line up, but for many folks, they don't line up. We might be sexually attracted to people that we don't want to have a relationship with, or want to have relationships with people we don't want to be sexual. That those two things, they can be different. And so I just have up here, this is not an exhaustive list of sexual orientations by any means, but I just wanted to put up a few that have emerged recently in kind of new language around sexual orientation. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to say in this kind of intro piece to identities within the community is that it's important to remember that behavior does not equal identity. So sexual orientation and gender identity are internal. We can't see them. Sexual behavior and gender expression are what we can see, right? That's the external piece. And it's important to remember that these things are different, because if we don't, then we can participate in, for example, something called bisexual erasure. So someone who's bisexual, I'm thinking about someone, my co-trainer identifies as bisexual, and she'll say, when I'm with a man, people are like, oh, so you're straight. When I'm with a woman, people are like, oh, so you're a lesbian. So her identity as a bisexual person is constantly erased because people make assumptions about her sexual orientation based on the gender of her partner. So we need to just remember that these things what we can see doesn't necessarily correlate to that person's identity, understanding of themselves. And the last piece is that sexual orientation and gender identity are separate aspects of our identity. So obviously not everyone who is lesbian, gay, or bi is also transgender. But conversely, not everyone who's transgender is also lesbian, gay, or bi. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm going to do about that piece. I'm happy to take questions at the end, or you can also email me your questions. Lucia's going to send out my email. But I hope that just kind of gets us all on the same page around language and identities within the community. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the specific forms of oppression that impact folks in our community. So this is not to say, obviously someone who's LGBTQ and a person of color is going to experience racism as well. Someone who's a lesbian is going to be experiencing sexism on top of these things. But this is just to talk about some of the specific ones that really impact our community. So heterosexism. So this is the belief that heterosexuality is the only natural or moral mode of sexual behavior. and that results in a system of bias and discrimination against same-sex sexuality and same-sex relationships. The most obvious example of kind of structural oppression that was structural heterosexism was the ban on marriage, right? And so the other one I'll talk about is cissexism. So this is the belief that transgender and non-binary identities are inferior to or less valid than cisgender identities. And that is then going to result in a system of bias and discrimination against folks who are trans, non-binary, or gender non-conforming. If you are heterosexual or cisgender, then you also benefit from privilege around those forms of your identity. So heterosexual privilege, cisgender privilege. I am, identify as a lesbian. So I'm a member of the LGBTQ community in that way, but I'm also cisgender, right? So even as someone within the LGBTQ community, I experience privilege around my cisgender identity, right? And I can be an ally to trans people, because of the privilege I carry as a cisgender person. So just very briefly, what we know about the impact of these things on LGBTQ folks. LGBTQ folks in all of these areas are experiencing greater numbers. So for example, LGBTQ folks have higher rates of poverty than cisgender and heterosexual folks. We have very disproportionate rates of homelessness. 40% of LGBTQ homeless youth 40% of all homeless youth identify as LGBTQ, for example. We have higher rates of drug and alcohol use. Anti-LGBTQ folks say that this is because we are promiscuous, right? We have these stereotypes that we're a party culture, we're not responsible or mature, things like that. But we know that this is a form of self-medication and a way of dealing with stigma and marginalization, rejection from family, etc. We have higher rates of suicide than the general population. We experience unique forms of hate and bias violence. We're 3 times more likely to have a mental health issue, the top 3 being depression, anxiety, and PTSD. We experience higher rates of sexual assault and domestic violence. Well, not higher rates of domestic violence. Let me take that back. I'll get into more details, more specifics in a minute. So to look specifically at the kind of violence work that I do, first, I want to address some of the common myths about LGBTQ violence and abuse. So first is that the myth that violence in LGBTQ relationships doesn't happen. That's a pretty prevalent myth that I come across when I'm working with mainstream DV and SB providers. That there are no laws against sexual assault if the sexual assault takes place between 2 women or 2 men. That men or masculine folks are never survivors and women or feminine folks are never perpetrators. And that if 2 women or 2 men are violent with one another, it's fighting, not abuse. Abuse is about power and control. It's not about gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. Any person can be an abuser or a perpetrator. Any person can be a victim. And all forms of LGBTQ violence are illegal. Just to give you some statistics, when we're looking at intimate partner violence, we see the same rate in LGBTQ relationships as we see in heterosexual cisgender relationships. So 1 in 4 members of our community will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. This was from the most recent survey by the CDC, I believe, in 2010. So this was asking, have you experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner? So we can see the numbers here. And I'll just point out that all of these forms of violence, whether that's intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or hate and bias violence, don't impact all members of our community at the same rates. So as you can see in these statistics right here, bisexual folks are experiencing these kinds of things at greater rates than lesbians and gay men. Transgender folks are experiencing these things at greater rates than lesbians and gay men. So in our work, we talk about why that might be. We have ideas, we have theories about what's going on there. Too much to get into in this presentation, but I do just want to point that out, that there are members of our community that are differently impacted by these things and are more at risk for these kinds of violence. So with sexual violence, some studies have shown that LGBTQ folks are at about the same risk as heterosexual cisgender folks. So about 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 8 men. But other studies, more recent studies within the past few years, have shown sexual violence being higher for our community than for heterosexual cisgender folks. And so again, look at bisexual folks and bisexual women specifically, and transgender folks. We're looking at 1 in 2. Okay. So I'm going to just end with some general best practices when working with LGBTQ identified survivors or victims, whatever language they prefer. Just kind of some general key attitudes and approaches. Be non-judgmental, open, professional, provide victim-centered care, reflect the victim's language, meet them where they are. So again, if we're talking specifically about the LGBTQ community, just for one example, you want to use the language that they use to identify themselves with them, right? So kind of in the beginning when I talked about using queer or not using queer. Be an ally in your work. Educate yourself. Watching this webinar is one way to do that. Interrupt homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia in your agency when you come across it, right? So the culture and climate in our agencies, we know things that impact the culture and climate, the comments, the kinds of things we hear in the office, the ways that staff talk to one another, all of those impact the culture and climate, and all of that trickles down then to the work that we do. Remember that people have the right to self-identify, and it's our job to honor that identity. And appreciate the risks LGBTQ people take when they seek assistance or when they come out to you. It always feels risky to us, right? Even if you might know you're a safe person, that your organization is a safe place, we don't know that necessarily, right? And so just appreciate that if someone tells you that they're LGBTQ, if they take that step to give you that information, to confide that to you, just appreciate that that felt risky, right? And it probably says something about the relationship you're building with them, so that's great. One of the ways we can create more inclusive and affirming agencies is to avoid assumptions. Don't assume that everyone you meet is heterosexual. Or I usually add here, don't assume that everyone you meet is either a man or a woman. I think that's a big one, right? We have more and more folks who are identifying as non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, right? So not everyone identifies as a man or a woman. Don't assume someone's sexual orientation based on the gender of their partner or the gender of their perpetrator. Don't assume someone's sexual orientation or gender identity based on their appearance. Don't assume someone's sexual orientation or gender identity is the same as the last time you worked with them. Things can change for people. If it's been 6 months, a year since you've maybe had interactions with someone, things might be different. And don't assume that LGBTQ people are engaging in risky or criminal behavior. Inclusive language is another way we can make our agencies feel more inclusive and affirming for our clients. And so one of the ways to do that is to try to avoid gendered language in your everyday work when and where you can, right? So we're in the Midwest. I am born and bred Midwesterner, so guys is a part of my vocabulary that I am working very hard to eliminate, because right in the Midwest, guys is it's our gender neutral, but it's really not, right? But thinking about, sir, ma'am, terms that we're told are respectful, ways to talk to someone to show respect. But if you are misgendering someone, that is never respectful. It doesn't feel respectful, right? So you'll see I've said the word folks a lot in this presentation. That's a word that kind of a gender neutral word that I have tried to incorporate to replace guys, but you all, there's lots of ways that we can eliminate these kind of daily unconscious gendered language that we use. So here's some more specific ones too, right? Person instead of man or woman, partner, significant other, sweetheart, relationship status instead of marital status, spouse, they instead of he or she, or parent or guardian instead of mother and father, right? So the ways that, if you're working with someone, or and this is about our interactions with coworkers. This is about our interactions in our everyday life as well, not just with clients, right? But you're meeting someone new, and instead of saying like, oh, do you and your husband live around here, right? It can be something as simple as saying, are you married, or are you in a relationship? What does your partner do? What do they do? Those simple kind of switches in our language can open up space for other ways of being. Pronouns is something that you might hear some talk about, something you may be talking about in your agency or you're trying to incorporate in your agency. So in our work, we typically lead off with our pronouns. So, my name's Nikki Engel. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. You might see it, people are starting to add it to signatures. I guess what I'll say about it is, internal to each agency, right, is something that you should look at the work you're doing and think about where it makes sense to incorporate these kinds of things. But working with clients, having a space, providing a space for them to self-identify their pronouns to you, again, creates that open space for that to happen, instead of them needing to create a time to correct you, right? Which is then, it's the difference between creating that space or forcing someone to come out, which can feel stressful. And how do you do that? So working with a client, in the introductions, I'm Nikki, my pronouns are she, her. How would you like to be addressed in our work together? What pronouns do you use? And again, that's with a lot of folks that we're working with. They're probably going to be like, pronouns, what is it you're asking me? But for the folks that identify as something, for example, more and more people who are non-binary or gender fluid or gender queer are going by they, them pronouns, which is not something that any of us tend to default to, right? So to create a space where that can be kind of put out there right at the beginning prevents you from misgendering someone throughout an entire conversation and prevents them from having to kind of correct you at some point. I would say it's really important to know your resources as well. Know what other agencies in the area potentially serve LGBTQ clients and can provide different kinds of support. LGBTQ folks, we experience a lot of isolation, and that's connected to, right, stigma and marginalization. So having LGBTQ supportive services, whether that's support groups, attachment to community groups, things like that can be really important. Are there any LGBTQ groups in the region where you are? And you can always contact me and I can help you identify those if you're having some trouble figuring out what might be some resources in your community. So just to wrap up, just some things to remember, right? LGBTQ people are present all over the state. We experience domestic violence and sexual violence at the same or higher rates than heterosexual people. We face unique barriers to service due to heterosexism and cissexism and the ways those manifest in kind of daily homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. Small verbal safety cues, just like the ones I just was able to touch on at the end, can really make a big difference. They're small, but they can do really good work. We are a resource for all of you, so please don't hesitate to contact us. If you call 612-822-0127 and dial option 3, that takes you to our helpline or crisis line. It's also how you would get to an advocate as opposed to maybe someone in policy and organizing or youth in schools. So doesn't have to be a crisis to call us. Please, you can call us with questions as they relate to a client you might be working with, questions about other supportive services in the area, etc. I think that's all I have.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah. I want to open it up then for questions, and James is going to take us back to our, we can see each other maybe a little better or hear each other. I don't know if that helps, but anyway, looks like we've got some questions in the chat.
Yeah, Amy had some questions. Amy, do you want to turn on your mic and ask? Or I can relay them to Nikki.
Looks like she's looking for citations. I'm happy to send those out. Mm-hmm.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yeah, they're on some slides, but I don't think all of them. When I update it, I don't always update the citations, so I should. but yeah, I'm happy to find those and send those out.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, it took me a while to find my unmute button. Thanks for sending those out. I think it's just important that whenever we're, for us, taking in the information that you just shared, if I then use use any of your stats, I want to be able to back them up. So that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Sure, I can send them out.
Great.
Nikki, I had a question along those lines. Do you know the numbers of teenagers that identify as trans, like in relation to Minnesota? Like, are more teenagers identifying as trans in Minnesota versus other states?
We don't have a lot of good information about that. Like, it was that question was asked in 2016 in our state survey. I mean, it's my impression that lots of states don't even have something like that, right? Where they're surveying youth to that degree, right? And so that was just asked in 2016. And when the data was compiled and that was released, that actually, the information went national, right? As like, look at how youth are identifying now. So my impression is that we don't have good data from other states in order to be able to compare that. The data we do have is in specific states, we do have some data about how LGBTQ youth are doing in schools. So some states have, and so what was also important that came from this 2016 data for our work was that in Minnesota, because we have a history of so much progressive policy around LGBTQ issues, there are many people who believe that we don't have issues in that area, right? So the LGBTQ youth, well, of course, our LGBTQ youth must be doing better than LGBTQ youth in Arkansas, right? Because we're such a progressive state. And what this data did tell us was that our LGBTQ youth are not doing any better. They are doing as poorly as LGBTQ youth across the country. And so that's a wake-up call, I think, in a lot of ways.
Well, and then as in some of the work that I've done, I've talked about the student survey with some of the prevention groups, and those, there are people who can opt out, and certainly private schools, some charter schools. So we're not even seeing the whole picture of Minnesota.
Right.
So.
Right, exactly.
Nikki, it looks like Amy also has a question. If you could talk about any violence prevention work OutFront is engaged in.
Yes. So we are working with MDH and Amy on some sexual violence prevention work. We got some grants through them. So last fall, we did some community conversations with LGBTQ folks in the Twin Cities, kind of talking to them about what sexual violence prevention has looked like for them. So if they've had sexual violence prevention programming prior, what did that look like? And where did they see gaps in terms of, was LGBTQ anything even addressed in the sexual violence prevention programming, et cetera? So we talked about gaps, and we talked about kind of what they saw as needs in the community. How to kind of create change in that area. And so we worked on that. And now I'm working with sexual violence prevention programs in the state and developing kind of an audit for them on their LGBTQ inclusion, right? And so are they including LGBTQ folks in their sexual violence prevention work? Again, where are the gaps there that we can help them meet and fulfill? And we're working with the youth that Blaine, my coworker, works with in our Youth Leadership Council on developing some sexual violence prevention programming for youth that is specifically for LGBTQ youth. So we have kind of a couple things going on in that arena.
Cool. Let's see, what is that?
That was just Amy.
Okay, thank you.
Your awesome work.
Does anyone else have any questions? We'd love to have you participate with us or comments. It doesn't have to be a question.
Kelly said, no questions, but thank you.
I have a question. You talked about male-identified victims or maybe gender nonconforming victims don't have access to shelters. Do you know of any plans? Are there any shelters that are trying to be more inclusive of those populations, or any plans to reach out to
Yes, I will say that through a grant we got from the Office of Violence Against Women, we've been working with shelters across the state, about a handful of shelters across the state who are thinking and trying to figure out, right, how do we become an all-inclusive shelter, right? What does that look like? What would that mean? What does that mean for the space, right? What does that require we do? So we are working with some shelters on that. As far as we know, right now, there's one shelter, one domestic violence shelter. So this is domestic violence specific, not homeless. There's one domestic violence shelter in the state who, at this point, will take anyone who's male identified. And so that's not a lot. Oftentimes when we have male identified victims who are fleeing violence, we have historically had to send them out of state. So it's been a much easier push to have domestic violence shelters get on board with bringing in trans women, right? Those have been much more productive conversations as they see, like, okay, yes, trans women are women. This is not an issue, right? Yes, we are open and welcoming to trans women. The move to bring men into DV shelter has been a lot more complicated.
Is that shelter located in the Twin Cities?
It is. Mm-hmm. It is.
Looks like Amy's got another question. Do you have any data, or are you hearing from community on sexual exploitation or trafficking, particularly for youth in Minnesota?
I don't have data, or I don't have much information about youth other than that we assume that's happening, right? We expect that that's happening. We don't, in the anti-violence program, our funding restrictions limit us to work with folks who are 18 and up. So that's part of the reason we're not working with LGBTQ youth in the anti-violence work very specifically, but working with adults, LGBTQ adults who are engaged in different kinds of survival sex is incredibly common, right? And so we assume and expect that youth are engaging in it too. We just don't actually, I don't have any more specific information than that. There's a lot of great agencies in the Twin Cities that do really good work with LGBTQ youth and homelessness and the intersection of that with sexual exploitation and trafficking, the Bridge, Youth Link, Avenues, et cetera. So they would probably be a better resource for information about that.
Great. Anyone else have anything you'd like to know or share with us? Anything more from you, Jessie?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Yes,
Yeah,
this has
thank
been
you.
so helpful. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up a little early because I don't believe we all sit and have nothing else to do. But know that you can always invite colleagues to join us. It's simple, have them into your office and share a computer, or send an email to Lucia and she will certainly get them on the invitation list. If you have an idea for a topic, or you've always wanted to know something and you'd like for us to go and do the legwork and try to get someone in here to tell you more about it, let us know, because we're here to help try to serve people better throughout our state, and especially women and their families. And you're always welcome to provide suggestions to us. We will send an evaluation out, and the slides, and then some additional information on contacts when we're done. And next, we've got, in January, we're hoping, we had originally had a No Wrong Door person with Hennepin County coming in. They've had to do some work travel, so we're going to be working on a substitute there. But we are going to get an update on the state STR opioid campaign from the agency that's actually doing the promotional work on the campaign. in February, and then also the Minnesota Prevention Resource Center will be here to talk more about how they can help us. I've recently used staff there to help me with data to help support creating programming, and it's a wonderful resource, and I'd love for more people to understand what kind of resource they are for us. So welcome. Thank you for being here, and hope you're with us next week and or 2 weeks, and bring a friend with you next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.